February 22nd devotional, Acts 3:19. Repent then and turn to God so that your sins may be wiped out, that times of refreshing may come from the Lord. Chapter 5. Of course she must buy the tea in Uncle Benjamin's grocery store. To buy it anywhere else would be unthinkable. Yet Valency hated to go to Uncle Benjamin's store on her 29th birthday. There was no hope that he would not remember it. Why? Demanded Uncle Benjamin leeringly as he tied up her tea. Are young ladies like bad grammarians? Valency, with Uncle Benjamin's will in the background of her mind, said meekly, I don't know. Why? Because, chuckled Uncle Benjamin, they can't decline matrimony. The two clerks, Joe Hammond and Claude Bertram, chuckled also, and Valency disliked them a little more than ever. On the first day Claude Bertram had seen her in the store, she had heard him whisper to Joe, Who is that? And Joe had said, Valency Sterling, one of the Deerwood old maids. Curable or incurable? Claude had asked with a snicker, evidently thinking the question very clever. Valency smarted anew with the sting of that old recollection. 29, Uncle Benjamin was saying. Dear me, Doss, you're dangerously near the second corner and not even thinking of getting married yet. 29, it seems impossible. Then Uncle Benjamin said the original thing. Uncle Benjamin said, How time does fly. I think it crawls, said Valency passionately. Passion was so alien to Uncle Benjamin's conception of Valency that he didn't know what to make of her. To cover his confusion, he asked another conundrum as he tied up her beans. Cousin Stickles had remembered the last moment that they must have beans. Beans were cheap and filling. What two ages are apt to prove illusories? Asked Uncle Benjamin, and not waiting for Valency to give it up, he added, mirage and marriage. Mirage is pronounced mirage, as said Valency shortly, picking up her tea and her beans. For the moment, she did not care whether Uncle Benjamin cut her out of his will or not. She walked out of the store while Uncle Benjamin stared after her with his mouth open. Then he shook his head. Poor Doss is taking it hard, he said. Valency was sorry by the time she reached the next crossing why she had lost her patience like that. Uncle Benjamin would be annoyed and would likely tell her mother that Doss had been impertinent to me, and her mother would lecture her for a week. I've held my tongue for 20 years, thought Valency. Why couldn't I have held it once more? Yes, it was just 20, Valency reflected, that she had first been twitted with her loveless condition. She remembered the bitter moment perfectly. She was just 9 years old, and she was standing alone on the school playground while the other little girls of her class were playing a game in which you must be chosen by a boy as his partner before you could play. Nobody had chosen Valency, little pale, black-haired Valency, with her prim, long-sleeved apron and odd slanted eyes. Oh, said a pretty little girl to her, I'm so sorry for you. You haven't got a beau. Valency had said defiantly, as she continued to say for 20 years, I don't want a beau. But this afternoon, Valency once and for all stopped saying that. I'm going to be honest with myself anyhow, she thought savagely. Uncle Benjamin's riddles hurt me because they are true. I do want to be married. I want a house of my own. I want a husband of my own. I want sweet little fat babies of my own. Valency stopped suddenly, aghast at her own recklessness. She felt sure that Reverend Dr. Stalling, who passed her at this moment, read her thoughts and disapproved of them thoroughly. Valency was afraid of Dr. Stalling, had been afraid of him ever since that Sunday 23 years before, when he had first come to St. Albans. Valency had been too late for Sunday school that day, and she had gone to the church timidly and sat in their pew. No one else was in the church, and nobody except the new rector, Dr. Stalling. Dr. Stalling stood up in front of the choir door, beckoned to her, and said sternly, Little boy, come up here. Valency had stared around her. There was no little boy. There was no one at all at the huge church itself. The strange man with blue glasses couldn't mean her. She was not a boy. Little boy, repeated Dr. Stalling, more sternly still, shaking his forefinger fiercely at her. Come up here at once. Valency arose as if hypnotized and walked up the aisle. She was too terrified to do anything else. What dreadful thing was going to happen to her? What had happened to her? Had she actually turned into a boy? She came to and stopped in front of Dr. Stalling. Dr. Stalling took his forefinger, such a long, knuckly forefinger, at her and said, Little boy, take off your hat. Valency took off her hat. She had a scrawny little pigtail hanging down her back, but Dr. Stalling was short-sighted and did not perceive it. Little boy, go back to your seat and always take off your hat in church, remember. Valency went back to her seat, carrying her hat like an ultimatum. Presently her mother came in. Doss, said Mrs. Sterling, what do you mean by taking off your hat? Put it on instantly. Valency put it on instantly. She was cold with fear lest Dr. Stalling should immediately summon her up front again. She would have to go, of course. It never occurred to her that one could disobey the rector, and the church was full of people now. Oh, what would she do if that horrible stabbing finger were shaking at her again before all those people? But Lindsay sat through the whole service in agony of dread and was sick for a week afterwards. No one knew why. Mrs. Frederick again bemoaned herself of her delicate child. Dr. Stalling found out his mistake and laughed over it to Valancy, who did not laugh. She never got over her dread of Dr. Stalling, and now be caught by him on a street corner thinking such things. Valancy got her John Foster book, Magic of Wings, his latest all about birds, said Miss Clarkson. She had almost decided that she would go home instead of going to see Dr. Trent. Her courage had failed her. She was afraid of offending Uncle James, afraid of angering her mother, afraid of facing gruff, shaggy-bowed old Dr. Trent, who would probably tell her, as he had told Cousin Gladys, that her trouble was entirely imaginary, and she had only had it because she liked to have it. No, she would not go. She would get a bottle of Redford's purple pills instead. Redford's purple pills were the standard medicine of the Sterling clan. Had they not cured second cousin Geraldine when 5 doctors had given up her? Valancy also felt very skeptical concerning the virtues of the purple pills, but there might be something in them, and it was easier to take them to face Dr. Trent alone. She would glance over the magazines in the reading room for a few minutes and then go home. Valancy tried to read a story, but it made her furious. On every page was a picture of the heroine surrounded by adoring men, and here she was, Valancy Sterling, who could not get a solitary beau. Valancy slammed the magazine shut. She opened Magic of Wings. Her eyes fell on the paragraph that changed her life. Fear is the original sin, wrote John Foster. Almost all the evil in the world has its origin in the fact that someone is afraid of something. It is a cold, slimy serpent coiling about you. It is horrible to live with fear, and all of its things degrading. Valancy shut Magic of Wings and stood up. She would go and see Dr. Trent. Chapter 6. The ordeal was not so dreadful after all. Dr. Trent was as gruff and abrupt as usual, but he did not tell her her ailment was imaginary. After he had listened to her symptoms and asked a few questions and made quick examination, he sat for a moment looking at her quite intently. Valancy thought he looked as if he were sorry for her. She caught her breath for a moment. Was the trouble serious? Oh, it couldn't be, surely. It hadn't bothered her much. Only lately it had gotten a little worse. Dr. Trent opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the telephone at his elbow rang sharply. He picked up the receiver. Valancy, watching him, saw his face change suddenly as he listened. Low, yes, what, yes. A brief interval. My God! Dr. Trent dropped the receiver, dashed out of the room and upstairs without even a glance at Valancy. She heard him rushing madly about overhead, barking out a few remarks to somebody, presumably his housekeeper. Then he came tearing downstairs with a club bag in his hand, snatched his hat and coat from the rack, jerked open the door, and rushed down the street in the direction of the station. Valancy sat alone in that little office, feeling more absolutely foolish than she had ever felt before in her life. Foolish and humiliated. So this was all that had come of her heroic determination to live up to John Foster and cast fear aside. Not only was she a failure as a relative and non-existent as a sweetheart or friend, but she was not even of any importance as a patient. Dr. Trent had forgotten her very presence in his excitement over whatever message had come by the telephone. She had gained nothing by ignoring Uncle James and flying in the face of the family tradition. For a moment she was afraid she was going to cry. It was all so ridiculous. Then she heard Dr. Trent's housekeeper coming down the stairs. Valancy rose and went to the office door. The doctor forgot all about me, she said with a twisted smile. Well, that's too bad, said Mrs. Patterson sympathetically. But it wasn't much wonder, poor man. That was a telegram of the phone for him for over the port. His son has been terribly injured in an auto accident in Montreal. The doctor just had 10 minutes to catch the train. I don't know what he'll do if something happens to Ned. He's just bound up in the boy. You'll have to come again, Mrs. Sterling. I hope it's nothing serious. Oh, nothing serious, agreed Valancy. She had felt a little less humiliated. It was no wonder poor Dr. Trent had forgotten her at such a moment. Nevertheless, she felt very flat and discouraged as she went down the street. Valancy went home by the shortcut of Lover's Lane. She did not often go through Lover's Lane, but it was getting near supper time, and it would never do to be late. Lover's Lane wound back of the village under great elms and maples, and deserved its name. It was hard to go there at any time and not find some canoodling couple or young girls in pairs, armed and twined, earnestly talking over their secrets. Valencia didn't know which made her feel more self-conscious and uncomfortable. This evening she encountered both. She met Connie Hale and Kate Bailey in new pink organdy dresses with flowers stuck coquettishly in their glossy bare hair. Valencia never had a pink dress or worn flowers in her hair. Then she passed a young couple she didn't know, wandering along, oblivious to everything but themselves. The young man's arm was about the girl's waist quite shamelessly. Valencia had never walked with a man's arm about her. She felt that she ought to be shocked. They might leave the sort of thing for the screening twilight, at least. But she wasn't shocked. In another flash of desperate, stark honesty, she owned to herself that she was merely envious. When she passed them, she felt quite sure that they were laughing at her, pitying her. That's the queer little old maid, Valencia Sterling. They said she never had a beau in her whole life. Valencia fairly ran to get out of Lover's Lane. Never had she felt so utterly colorless and skinny and insignificant. Just where Lover's Lane debouched onto the street, an old car was parked. Valencia knew that car well, by the sound at least, and everybody in Deerwood knew it. This was before the phrase Tin Lizzie had come into circulation in Deerwood, at least, but if it had been known, this car was the tiniest of Lizzies. Though it was not a Ford, but an old gray Slauson. Nothing more battered and disreputable could be imagined. It was Barney Snaith's car, and Barney himself was just scrambling up from underneath it in overalls plastered with mud. Valencia gave him a swift, furtive look as she hurried by this. This was the only second time she had ever seen the notorious Barney Snaith, though she had heard enough about him in the 5 years that he had been living up back in Muscatine. First time had been nearly a year ago on the Muscatine road. He had been crawling out from under his car then too, and he gave her a cheerful grin as she went by, a little whimsical grin that gave him the look of an amused gnome. He didn't look bad. She didn't believe he was bad, in spite of the wild yarns that were always being told of him. Of course, he went tearing in that terrible old gray Slauson through Deerwood at hours when all decent people were in bed. Often the old roaring Abel who made the night hideous with howls, both of them dead drunk, my dear, and everyone knew that an escaped convict and a defaulting bank clerk and a murderer in hiding and an infidel and an illegitimate son of the old roaring Abel Gay, and the father of roaring Abel is a legitimate grandchild and a counterfeiter and a forager and a few other awful things. But still Valencia did not believe he was bad. Nobody with a smile like that could be bad, no matter what he had done. It was that night the Prince of the Blue Castle changed from being grim jaw and hair with a dash of premature gray to a rakish individual with overlong tawny hair dashed with red, dark brown eyes, and ears that stuck out just enough to give him an alert look, but not enough to be called flying jibs. But he still retained something a little grim about the jaw. Barney Snaith looked even more disreputable than usual just now. It was very evident that he hadn't shaved for days. His hands and arms, bare to the shoulders, were black with grease. But he was whistling gleefully to himself, and he seemed so happy that Valencia envied him. She envied him his light-heartedness and his irresponsibility, and his mysterious little cabin up on the island in Mistawas. Even his rackety old gray Slauson. Neither he nor his car had to be respectable and live up to traditions. When he rattled past her a few minutes later, bareheaded, leaning back in his Lizzie at a rakish angle, his long hair blowing in the wind, a villainous-looking old black pipe in his mouth, she envied him again. Men had the best of it, no doubt about that. This outlaw was happy, whatever he was or wasn't. She, Valencia Sterling, respectable, well-behaved to the last degree, was unhappy and always been unhappy, so there you were. Valencia was just in time for supper. The sun had clouded over, and a dismal drizzling rain was falling again. Cousin Stickles had the neuralgia. Valencia had to do the family darning, and there was no time for magic of wings. "Can't the darning wait until tomorrow?" she pleaded. "Tomorrow will bring its own duties," said Mrs. Frederick inexorably. Valencia darned all the evening and listened to Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles talking about the eternal niggling gossip of the clan as they knitted drearily in the interminable black stockings. They discussed second cousin Lillian's approaching wedding and all its bearings. On the whole, they approved. Second cousin Lillian was doing well for herself. "Though she hasn't hurried," said Cousin Stickles, "she must be 25. "There have not, fortunately, been many old maids in our connection," said Mrs. Frederick bitterly. Valencia flinched. She had run the darning needle into her finger. Third cousin Aaron Gray, who had been snatched by a cat and had blood poisoning in his finger. "Cats are most dangerous animals," said Mrs. Frederick. "I would never have a cat about the house." She glared significantly at Valency through her terrible glasses. Once, 5 years ago, Valency had asked if she might have a cat. She had never referred to it since, but Mrs. Frederick still suspected her of harboring the unlawful desire in her heart of hearts. Once Valency sneezed. Now in Sterling code, it was very bad form to sneeze in public. You can always repress a sneeze by pressing your finger on your upper lip, said Mrs. Frederick rebukingly. 9:30, and so, as Mr. Pepys would say, to bed. But first Cousin Stickle's neuralgic back must be rubbed with Redfern's liniment. Valency did that. Valency always had to do it. She hated the smell of the Redfern's liniment. She hated the smug, beaming, portly, bewhiskered, bespectacled picture of Dr. Redfern on the bottle. Her fingers smelled of the horrible stuff after she got into bed, in spite of all the scrubbing she gave them. Valency's day of destiny had come and gone. She had ended it where she had begun, in tears. talk to you about Disney Dreamlight Valley when I'm planting my onions and I'm harvesting my crop, and then when I have like 600 onions or more, I'll glitch the system. So this is a video of where I've already harvested the onions. It's 500 to be exact. And then when the character, whoever my character is, and then this one it happens to be, I think it's Stitch. I think Wally's just, no, it was Wally. It was Wally. He's over there in the garden. You'll see him right there. They'll throw out the extra crop for you that they've collected because they're your helper. So this is the crop he's thrown out, and this is what it looks like when I have to harvest it all. So I wanted to give you a little clip just to show you what that looked like, since I'm all the time talking about it. So I hope you enjoy it. Thanks, bye.